Okay, hello and welcome to tonight's discussion on activism in the real estate state. My name is Anna Kramer. I'm excited to be a part of this and we're really glad to have you all joining us. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Planners Network together with the McGill School of Urban Planning, the University of Toronto's Affordable Housing Challenge, and the community-based Action Research Network in Park Extension of Montreal. We invite you to become a member of Planners Network, to continue conversations like these, and to check out our magazine, Progressive City. We're meeting virtually from various locations on Turtle Island. These places are the traditional home of many nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka in Montreal, the Mississaugas, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat in Toronto, the Coast Salish people of Vancouver, and the Lenape in New York City. May we recall the treaties, including the One Dish with One Spoon and the Great Peace, in our discussion about housing justice tonight. The housing crisis is a real estate game. This observation comes to us from the Encampment Support Network in Toronto, and it strikes me as an accurate assessment of our current situation. Real estate and rent are producing growing inequality in cities. We are here to discuss how we can change the rules of this game. To help us understand the context we're in, the importance of housing activism, and the positionality of urban planning and the state, we welcome Samuel Stein. Sam is the author of Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. Joining the conversation to share different strategies and perspectives is also Vincent Tao, who's working for tenure equality and tenants' rights in Vancouver, Mercedes Sharp-Zayas and Ali Khan Pabani, who are organizing with communities in the Parkdale neighborhood of Toronto, and Fayez Abouani, who works to secure market-based affordable housing using social finance in a neighborhood home to many newcomers in Montreal. Let's talk about Sam's book to start. Real estate and its financial instruments have become increasingly central to economic growth. Sometimes described as a wall of money seeking an investment, the function of profit generation is taking precedence over the shelter function of housing. A widening wealth gap between owners and renters is driving inequality and unaffordability. Sam, can you talk about how this manifests in the housing situation in cities? How has the balance of power influencing housing policy changed since the industrial era? And why is activism so important in this context?
Sure. So thanks for inviting me here, and I'm really excited for this conversation. It's great to see some friends here and to meet the rest of the panelists too. What I describe in the book, I call the rise of the real estate state, in order to show that the kind of changes that you just described are at least as much economic and social as they are political. This is really about, or at least as much about, the role of the capitalist state in producing gentrification, in enabling real estate speculation, as it is about those market forces themselves and the people behind them. So the real estate state is not a totality. It's not that we are living in a real estate state so much as the real estate state is a part of government, but it's an increasingly important and powerful one. So it's kind of like we talk about the carceral state, the welfare state. Right-wingers talk about the administrative state. They're not necessarily talking about the whole thing. They're talking about a component of it that acts in a certain way. And so it's kind of a fractional analysis, right? It's a fraction of the state. We need to have a fractional analysis of the state to show the different parts that are kind of in tension with one another and in competition. Also a fractional analysis of capital to show that not all capitalists want the same thing from the state, though they all certainly want to profit, and a fractional analysis of the working class as well, to show why it is that we're not the united force that could take on the world. So that kind of takes me into the next thing, the balance of power shifting. There's a lot of money that is looking for a return on investment through real estate at the same time as cities are looking for stable and rising revenue streams. And that combination of forces kind of gives us the city that we're familiar with in all the cities that are represented on this panel. There's three elements to that shift. There's a shift in capital, which you referred to in talking about deindustrialization. So a lot of classical planning theory assumes that there is manufacturing capital and real estate capital, and part of the role of planning is to kind of mediate between the two while keeping the interests and participation of labor, the public, as part of the process. Over the last 50 years or so, a lot of cities in Canada and the US have experienced deindustrialization, and manufacturing capital has gone to other places, be that other areas of within the countries that we live in or other parts of the world. This creates vacuums, creates three vacuums. An economic vacuum, where the economic function of cities has to be taken up by some other element of capital, and to a large extent it's been real estate in coordination with finance. It creates a spatial vacuum, where there used to be all this space taken up by industry, and now it gets sort of put over to high-end residential use via real estate or commercial use, but real estate use. And then a political vacuum, where the demands of capital on the state used to be somewhat in tension with itself, are now dominated by that real estate and finance sector. And so the kind of functioning of planning, the logic of planning, looks a lot like the logic of real estate. Then finally, and I won't get into this too much, but we also need to have a fractional analysis of labor in all this, with a flow of even workers' investment money going into housing, expecting a return, be they homeowners or labor unions with pensions that are investing in real estate as a strategy, and unions and nonprofits kind of taking advantage of or understanding this being the political climate in which they live and retooling their platforms to fit within it. So finally, you asked about why is activism so important in this, and the answer for me is that if you understand real estate to be kind of the growing force that's running our cities, it therefore makes the tenant struggle and the housing struggle, the homeless struggle, even more central than it was before in contesting the future of our cities. There is a lot of money that's invested into real estate, but there's also a lot of debt, and therefore a lot of money on the line, which tenants and housing movements are kind of in a unique position to challenge, and can really throw the whole system out of whack. Other things can do that as well, such as a global pandemic that creates a recession, but political movements can take that kind of exogenous factor, this outside thing that happened and shook up the real estate market, and push it in a political direction. I'll end there. Thanks. You're muted, Anna.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. It's good to hear about the fractional analysis necessary to understand the different kind of forces at play, so we can really contextualize ourselves at this moment in time. So let's move to on the ground now. We've invited people from 3 Canadian cities who work in different ways to challenge real estate interests in the interest of housing justice in neighborhoods and cities experiencing housing crises and displacement. These are a few of the many dedicated activists working in multiple ways towards housing equality. Can you each describe, first of all, the urban housing situation where you work, and who you work with and how you organize, and then what strategies you employ in this struggle? Let's start in the West and go East, starting with Vincent Tao.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. My name is Vince. I'm an organizer with the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users and also on the steering committee of the Vancouver Tenants Union. So yeah, I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I also thought it would be important to recognize we had some bad news last night. We lost a very like I would say a good friend and like big comrade in the housing struggle here, Ron Kolke. Yeah, he I met him at like a tent city action that we were organizing, and he was always the guy who would be like texting me about, hey, I'm gonna cut a hole in the fence and I'm gonna patch it back up, and that's how we're gonna get in. And on the day of, we actually, like, there was just like this huge crowd at the front gate, and we just ended up just pushing it over. And Ron was at the back just being like, what the hell? Yeah. Really good dude, and this one's for him. But yeah, so the urban housing situation in Vancouver, I don't know, guys. It's like, you've seen the timeline is bad. It's like, it's really bad. It's a 53%, I think, renters, and then the rest are homeowners. We have skyrocketing rents. I think, Toronto and Vancouver are in an arms race to see which city can charge the most for a 1-bedroom. And despite the historic work of the YIMBY avant-garde kind of movement here, the vacancy rates are near zero, right? And so it's a familiar situation. And yeah, I guess like I'll just limit what I can describe to what's relevant to, I guess, Sam's ideas and his book. So yeah, Vancouver started out as a settler outpost. Its historic and geographic significance was a complete accident of a real estate scam that was, I guess, brokered between private and state federal speculators working with the rail line. And since then, it's kept close to that tradition, that time-honored tradition of real estate interests essentially running the entire city. And so, in the last century and a half, yeah, the rate of profit for these things goes down, it dips as it does. And capital has to find new frontiers to make some more money, right? And so it always finds these kind of internal frontiers in urban space to dispossess and create new, spaces for extraction and profit. And, that's historically places like Chinatown, Japantown, which is now bulldozed, Hogan's Alley, Vancouver's Black neighborhood, completely gone. And then, of course, where I work now, the downtown east side, right? These are all kind of internal frontiers that are always being pushed and levered by a planner class, right? And so I guess it's to kind of skip forward to our current era. You can't talk about Vancouver without talking about Vision Vancouver. So in 2008, a municipal party, we have municipal parties, that's a whole other story. There's no ward system for some reason. I'm not gonna get into that. But so this municipal party, which was engineered split from our traditional left-wing party, COPE. It was the split between the guys who wanted to take real estate money and then everyone else who didn't, and guess who won? So the people who took the money, they dominated council 2008 to 2018, right? And this is how, you get the glistening hellscape that's Vancouver today, was kind of reconstructing City Hall as this like money printing machine for real estate. But there are technical aspects, which is why I think, Sam, not to kiss your ass, your book was very eye-opening for us. It was really important for us to kind of, or at least for me, to understand the kind of the technical and legal power of like the planner class, I would call them, right? And so I'll just say, so in that gap, right? So there's like the 2008 to 2018, Vision Vancouver rebuilds the city. And of course, like in between 2010, that's when the Olympics happened, right? And that's, I'm sure people are familiar with that same process. It's kind of like a neoliberal, like great leap forward kind of thing, where there's a total mobilization of police force, planner class people, finance, in order to transform a city, right? But also, eliminate undesirable classes of people. And so that's been the legacy of Vision Vancouver, right? And so, as I said, it's 2018, they were swept out of council, people hated them, they're gone, which is fantastic. It was very enjoyable to watch. But the thing is, things haven't changed, right? And so we're 2 years onward, we have a kind of, more mixed composition of council, yet the same real estate nightmare continues to persist. And that's because there's still the ghost in the machine, right? Which is city staff. And so, yeah, and I think that understanding city staff's role as an unelected kind of elite class of technocrats, again, I think is really important to kind of embed into our tenant struggles, that understanding of them. And also I'll list a few ways in which it works. So I think the most kind of obscene way it works is that it's an easy way for council to essentially launder its motions and then spit them back out with the complete opposite result, right? So I'll give you an example. So there's been a long tenant struggle that, for instance, I met Ron through for social housing at this site called 58 West Hastings. You can look it up. And it's been like a 20-year struggle. And there have been these crescendos in the movement where on the ground organizing, we're able to, push city council, the mayor, to sign these agreements that say, yes, I'm going to build 100% social housing, which was a challenge to the dominant logic of social mixed housing, right? And so we wanted 100% social housing in the heart of the downtown east side to be community controlled. We got them to say yes to this on multiple occasions in council, multiple motions, multiple agreements. Eventually, but what would happen is that they would pass it to city staff, and these people like make a ton of money. There's like the city manager who makes more money than like half of council combined, and this kind of like what you're like, rats warren of city staff who run around city hall. And what they do is that they create these like big stacks of paper that are like reports that say, hey, we looked at this whole thing, this whole social housing thing. We recommend that you actually just don't do it. And we're right, because we get paid a lot of money and we have master's degrees. And this is how essentially these kind of democratic decisions at council are, again, laundered through the city staff, the city planner network, and then spit back out to have opposite ends, right? Another way in which, I think more concrete way that we struggle against, the planners and planning policy is something like the tenant relocation and protection policy. So this is a policy that was, unrolled in 2015 as a response to people pushing against constant dem evictions, right? Big, entire neighborhoods getting swept away, condos being built on top. And so you look at the name, tenant relocation protection policy. It does neither of those things, obviously. But what it really, our analysis of how this works is that what it did was, eviction is a nasty process, right? It's a dirty one. No one really wants to do it. They do it anyway. But what the TRPP did was that it rationalized this process, right? Because what it did was it did this kind of calculus of like, okay, if you've lived here for this many years, you get this much cash buyout. You sign a thing and you're out. So what it does, it makes legible, makes rational, a kind of calculus of displacement, which allows developers to work with City Hall to plan out displacement on a higher scale, right? And it throws the whole tenant struggle into this kind of just interpretation of this one policy. So again, these are ways in which we continuously come up against the city staff, its planners in the tenant struggle, which I think is I don't know, not to say that innovation in thinking, but it was really important for us to read Sam's book, which we did at the Tenants Union, to kind of start to understand what we've been strategizing against the last couple of years. So to get to what I do then is that I've been working with the Tenants Union for a while. I'm actually from Scarborough, so shout out to Scarborough, if anyone's there. And then also I studied and worked with FIEs and Mercedes Montreal, but I came here around 5 years ago. And started getting involved in Chinatown anti-gentrification fights and fights for social housing in the downtown east side. Eventually, the Vancouver Tenants Union was not the first tenants union to exist in Vancouver, unfortunately, but it was, these things go through cycles and came back together. But I would say that our activity had a few different phases, right? So it was like our first year, we're kind of just trying things out, doing like nuts and bolts tenant organizing, going into buildings, organizing tenants to fight the landlord, eventually getting to the residential tenancy branch where a lot of these things are adjudicated and hopefully winning there and continuing to build power through those fights. And then in our second year, through City Hall, kind of, we got like our activist Bernie Sanders style person in City Hall, the one person. And so through that, we were trying to push policy and motions through City Hall, right? Again, with mixed results. And what I was saying, this kind of last and third year, this third year, not the last year, we entered into COVID. There was a surge in back to basics tenant organizing, which again died down as soon as CERB came out. That's another story. But what we did was start to think about neighborhood organizing, right? And thinking about like a big scale fights, how to connect that on the ground tenant organizing, knocking on doors to a larger kind of political terrain. And I think that this was key to our thinking because we saw that our on the ground door knocking and building fights wouldn't always add up to a larger movement. It would like, we'd fight the fight, it'd go through the judicial process, and then hopefully we'd win, and then people would disperse. So we were thinking this time around, especially through this last fight in just not too far away here, Broadway in Carolina, there was only one tenant facing off with like a giant developer. And so we had to, out of necessity, mobilize the neighborhood in a different way. It wasn't just like the tenants in a building fighting the landlord, but rather it was the neighborhood mobilized by the union to fight both the developer and the city staff that were using this TRPP to evict the one tenant, right? And I think that, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but what the kind of thinking is, and the challenge is to be able to locate and anchor the eviction as like, the point of crisis, but within a larger terrain of struggle, right? Understanding the city as a, terrain of struggle is really important, because otherwise, the average tenant is facing constantly this barrage from all directions of like, new development applications, rising rents, right? Foreclosures everywhere, evictions happening. And it just adds up to this kind of like general feeling of misery. So if we're able to kind of bridge that gap between, the point of eviction to this larger process that involves not just the petty landlord, but the city, the finance class, real estate interests, all of it together, then we draw the line in the sand, right? And this is coming up, and why this is becoming such a big issue for us is that, like, typically in our, like, to take a look inside, when we do the building organizing, oftentimes our chapters in the union are kind of neighborhood based, but they would come together and disperse around the fight, right? So after the building kind of won the fight, they would disperse as a chapter. But after this last fight, which mobilized the neighborhood, we've been continuing to meet as Mount Pleasant as a chapter for the last 5 months, right? And we've been still taking on building fights and supporting tenants through that process. But we're also looking at this like major plan that's being dropped on the city, which is the Broadway plan. And so the city is now, they've unrolled this new citywide plan to, build a big new subway line across the city. And of course, this is like a 5-year process, and they're doing all their consultations. And we saw this, and it's been sped up through the COVID timeline, right? Because you walk out in COVID. I remember the first couple of weeks when it was still like weird and mysterious, that it would be completely quiet, but new construction was still happening, right? And it had sped up, and there are actually like provincial orders that gave city council the power to push through developments without having it go through council. So again, they use this essentially crisis to use emergency measures to cut out the democratic aspects of planning and go straight to just like, yeah, let's pump up real estate, right? And so, just not, again, a block away from me, the entire intersection there, they fenced it off in like one day and said, hey, the Ministry of Land is taking this for the new Broadway line, right? And so we see that as like the city is starting a war, right? This is going to be a 5-year war, and we have to fight for our homes. And so by taking the organizing just like from out of the building and into the neighborhood, having both of them happen at the same time, right? Building a base through, classic tenant organizing, but also elevating that fight to a political level, I think is the future of our union, I would hope, right? And
Okay.
plan itself, oh, sorry.
No, thanks, Vince. I think we're gonna circle back and get to the specific kind of like, that next level of kind of engaging with a kind of larger plan in the next section of the discussion. So thanks for all that context. Really great. Okay, so next, Mercedes and Alican, do you want to go first, Mercedes, and talk about park sales?
I think Alican was going to open us up. Alican, do you want to go for it?
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me? Are you? Yeah, okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. And Vince, I couldn't agree with you more about moving from the building level to a larger political strategy. It's really inspiring to hear what's coming out of Vancouver, and we're definitely keeping a close eye on what you all are up to. It's amazing stuff, and thank you for that analysis. Maybe I'll just go over a little bit about, I guess, some of the stuff that we've been doing on the ground here. Mercedes will get more into, I think, like the planning aspect, and I'll just kind of talk a little bit about like some of like the, I guess, on like I don't know how to contrast that, but yeah. Anyway, so when the first lockdown happened here in Ontario, I guess a bunch of us tenants like really mobilized really quickly, understanding that, you know, maybe there was the stimulus on the way from the federal government. Maybe it was coming, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was going to be enough, maybe it wasn't, or maybe it would cover everyone, maybe it would only cover some people, but we can't afford to wait. So what we did was we organized a rent strike. We collectively withheld our rent with the demands of canceling all rent arrears accrued throughout COVID. That was our main demand. We didn't want anyone to get evicted from their homes, and we knew that this Canada emergency relief benefit wouldn't cover everyone and it wouldn't be sufficient. And lo and behold, we were correct about that. So we did a lot of building level organizing, trying to get tenants on board, both tenants that didn't have the money and just didn't have the money to pay rent because they had lost employment because of obvious reasons, because of the lockdown. And so that they were not withholding voluntarily. They were withholding because they simply didn't have the money. And then there were also those tenants that we were trying to get on board who had the money and get them to withhold voluntarily in order to build a critical mass of pressure to put on the landlords and also the government. And then so what we did was we didn't stop there. We did quite a few actions. We went to Queen's Park. We went to landlords' homes even to visit and deliver petitions and apply pressure at their personal residences and stuff like that. The province, the way that they responded was they, after the CERB came in and the province did a lockdown, they at the same time put or enacted an eviction moratorium. And we knew that this was going to end up in disaster if that wasn't coupled with some kind of rent relief of some kind, right? Because it's essentially just kicking the can down the road. So when that happened, we kept organizing. We kept doing all trying to build our power at the building level. And then when the eviction moratorium was lifted, there was what they called an eviction blitz, which was like a bunch of online hearings, which are still ongoing. And coupled with that, right before they lifted the moratorium, the province passed what is called Bill 184, which is colloquially named the mass eviction bill. And what that essentially meant was that these repayment agreements that were being pushed by landlords during the lockdown were now being made like legitimate and legally binding to some extent. So whereas before, if you did not pay rent, the landlord would file to evict you for non-payment of rent. Then you go to the landlord tenant board, go through a mediation process, and then you'd come to an agreement on how to repay that money, and both parties would agree and that kind of thing. But Bill 184, one of the main things that it did was it made these repayment agreements legally valid, even if they were signed between the landlord and tenant outside the landlord and tenant board. So you see these agreements, or what I'm seeing with my neighbors is people entering these agreements under duress, really untenable repayment plans. And Bill 184 essentially makes it so that if you default on any of these repayment plans, you're up for an automatic no notice eviction without a hearing, which caused a lot of uproar. And we tried to bring attention to that. That was only one part of Bill 184. There are other parts of it. I won't get into too much detail, but just quickly, one of the other aspects of Bill 184 was that if the landlord raises your rent illegally and you pay that rent, after a year of paying that rent, you cannot contest it. It just becomes the legal rent. And so a lot of people just understandably don't know, what the requirements of landlords and what the rules are on landlords, the limitations on raising rent and stuff like that. And so that worked in their favor. Also, it made dealing with repairs in conjunction with eviction hearings a lot more difficult. You have to file in advance and all that kind of thing. Anyway, so when we applied a lot of pressure on the city, we tried to get the mayor to direct the Toronto police not to enforce evictions, and he flat out just denied that they were involved in evictions. We all know that the police are the last resort to enforce property rights. So that's what they did, and we asked the mayor to supplant the provincial eviction moratorium with a citywide moratorium, and he refused to do that, saying that he didn't have the powers under his emergency powers. That didn't qualify as something that he could do. So we tried to apply pressure there, and now there's a new moratorium in place that does not cover the closing of the landlord-tenant board. It's a moratorium on the enforcement of evictions. So the landlord-tenant board is going on at full steam. It's a lot of people are just calling it an eviction factory. We have like 60-second evictions in some cases where tenants aren't even informed that they have their hearing. And obviously there are a lot of accessibility issues and stuff like that. I mean, that's a whole can of worms that I won't get into, but if you look at some of the documentation that some of my colleagues have been doing, and myself as well, on these eviction hearings, it's pretty bleak. And I could talk more about tenants, but just quickly about ESN, the Encampment Support Network. Obviously, like, this eviction crisis is pushing a lot of people into homelessness. And when the lockdown first struck, there was there were guidelines that shelters could not operate the way they were operating at capacity because of COVID restrictions. So they're essentially, the shelter capacity in Toronto halved overnight. And a lot of these people, they were pushed out onto the streets or voluntarily left the shelters because they didn't feel safe because of COVID. And so a lot of these encampments, many of the encampments were there before, but the problem was exacerbated by COVID. And so they became more visible, more central. And so a lot of people, unhoused people, have been camping outside for various reasons. And what the city did to respond was they opened a few of these, or they leased a few of these hotels for short-term leases that were slated to be demolished, and offered those spaces. And the encampment residents that were offered these spaces had mixed reviews, and many of them returned to living or to sleeping outside for various reasons, including, lack of COVID safety protocols, lack of properly trained staff for overdose prevention, criminalization. They were just plopped in these neighborhoods where there's a lot of NIMBYism, pushback, and violence against unhoused people, and police attention. The rules in these shelters, they're really like strict curfews, and rules around drug use were prohibitive. You could get evicted immediately if you're caught using on the premises and that kind of thing. Anyway, so the Encampment Support Network has been really, really trying to push for proper permanent housing through methods like expropriation is a main one, opening up more shelter space in the meantime. And we're trying to really, really push for a cessation of the encampment clearings, which are extreme violence when the city does not have enough space to offer for people for the winter. It's getting to be like, it's going to be really, really cold in a couple of weeks. We've luckily had like a fairly mild winter in Toronto. But yeah, that's basically what we're trying to do, is just to get the city to stop clearing these encampments, instead to use those resources, instead of spending it on cops and park security and that kind of thing. They should be spending it on survival gear for encampment residents in the meantime, while they're able to open up adequate amounts of housing. And the expropriation of speculative property in order to create enough housing for folks so that nobody has to live outside. I'll leave it there. Sorry if I took a little too long, but I'll pass it on to Mercedes.
Oh, thank you so much, Ali Khan. And I feel like you're being a bit humble. Ali Khan's been involved in so many years of tenant organizing. Some people might have heard about the Parkdale rent strikes back in 2017. He was one of the core organizers involved in that. And I think a lot of the examples of how tenant organizing can directly intervene in the type of real estate capital happening in apartment towers, and the type of activism that happened across country in terms of targeting the pensions that were actually funding a lot of the eviction pressures that were taking place in those buildings. So just huge shout out to Ali Khan's work, and hopefully he can come back to that, and also to Vince out west. So awesome to be on a panel alongside you. I just have a lot of utmost respect and learn a lot from these organizers and friends. So yeah, just super grateful to be here. So my name's Mercedes Sharp-Zayas. I work with a project called the Parkdale People's Economy. So we're a network of over 30 different community-based organizations and hundreds of community members in Parkdale who are pushing for decent work, shared wealth, and equitable development in the neighborhood. And what the project itself actually tries to do is really to incorporate and to blend planning and organizing hand in hand as a core way of building out alternative visions for the future of the neighborhood, and also of connecting to wider struggles that are happening across the city at large. Parkdale itself, it's a traditionally working class, racialized community. Around 90% of people living in the community are renters. About a third of the community are low income, a third are newcomers. And so when we actually think about the gentrification driven displacement that's happening in Parkdale, it's really directly correlated to the racialization, feminization, and geographic concentration of poverty that we see happening across the city of Toronto, and the literal segregation we see happening not only across the city, but as I'm sure many other cities can relate in terms of those types of processes and pushes that are taking place. Specifically, a lot of our work tries to understand what these actual drivers are when we talk about big concepts like gentrification. So we recognize it as a racialized class project that in many ways is rooted in settler colonialism that disproportionately impacts the communities, as I mentioned, in Parkdale. So low-income working class, racialized Black and Indigenous communities, psychiatric survivors, and people living with disabilities. And so what we try to do in our planning work is actually to center the visions of these very communities who would otherwise be the most at risk of displacement in building out what kinds of alternative visions can be created on a neighborhood-wide level. A lot of our planning work really recognizes that change is a constant, right? Neighborhood change is probably something we can't necessarily fight against. It's inevitable. That being said, the way that change is actually taking place is something that we can alter and shift. And once again, this comes back to that question of how we can build out greater community ownership over land, labor, money, and over democratic processes that are actually taking place, and not just letting those sit at the hands of the city or within different institutional players, but really bringing that back to the grassroots. So the Parkdale People's Economy, in terms of how we actually go about doing our work, a lot of it is based in community-based research and planning processes, and then also, once again, coupling that with the direct kind of organizing work to make sure that any of the reports or plans that we actually do create aren't just something that are going to sit on on a bookshelf. It's actually something that's going to come to life and is going to be reenacted at any type of political intervention or level that we want to see happening. Over the years, we've created a community-based vision and planning study for the Parkdale neighborhood. This was done through an 18-month participatory planning process. We've also created a neighborhood-wide community benefits framework, really trying to set minimum targets when new developments do come into the neighborhood, and trying to push changes in our understanding of how development really does define things such as affordability, or where housing takes place, who should be prioritized for housing in a way that doesn't actually benefit in any way communities in which those developments are taking place. And a lot of the work as well, once again, in order for us to bring this to life, we kind of try to target specific spaces or sites of struggle where we can actually see these kinds of community visions take place. So a couple examples of where this has taken place. Very recently, we were engaging with a large-scale public health institution known as the University Health Network, who, unknown to many folks, actually owned a number of different residential properties in the South Parkdale neighborhood. Three of these were sitting vacant for over 15 years, one to the point of being demolished. The rest of the homes that were currently tenanted were left to significant states of disrepair. So we engaged in sort of a community benefits negotiation process with that specific health institution, and we were really pressuring them to try and move their homes into social ownership and Ultimately, now that's been passed through Section 37, which is a specific type of planning tool in Ontario that unfortunately actually takes away a lot of the power at the community level. So while in some ways those homes will now be social housing, it wasn't actually the kind of community win we were really trying to push for, but we're still trying to figure out the ways to intervene in that kind of a process. Another example of this taking place is in private developments. So one big example of a campaign we're currently running is in response to a former rooming house called the Queen's Hotel, which is just a block away from where I currently work, which is a drop-in center in Parkdale. And that site, the Queen's Hotel, in 2015, a new developer took over the property and they conducted a mass unlawful eviction. They evicted over 27 tenants from their homes with less than 7 days notice, under the premises that these were actually hotel dwellers and not actually tenants, even though there was clear documentation that people had been paying their ODSP checks to the developer for years. And ultimately, once again, this led to a very violent eviction. Several people passed away from this process. Many people still continue to be homeless and dealing with housing insecurity. And of course, sure enough, several years later, so just last year, we started to see new development plans coming forward on this specific site. Interestingly enough, in a lot of the planning reports we actually saw coming from planning firms, they specifically omitted the very history where these types of unlawful evictions were taking place. Like the timeline literally went from early 2000s to 2014 as their history report, and it just only ended there, which is completely ridiculous. So it just goes to show once again how planning forces still are very much so at service to capitalist interests and ultimately pushing forward the developer's agenda. So a lot of our work right now has been really just trying to bring forward the actual community history of this site, forefronting the voices and the stories of formerly evicted tenants, and similarly people who have lived in similar housing situations, to share demands really for those units to be replaced and to be offered at the same rate as they were when they were evicted. Ideally, once again, through an agreement, but we have now seen that that developer specifically appealed this development. So they have actually circumvented an entire public process, so that now in order to engage with them, you have to be accompanied by lawyers and hired planners to engage in what is called the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. So once again, these are just a couple examples of what's taking place in Parkdale, but there's a huge onset of private development taking place across the neighborhood, and opportunities for community members to come together to organize in these spaces. And once again, I'm speaking very specifically just about some of the interventions happening in the development processes. That being said, there's also amazing work that's taking place, as we heard from Ali Khan, around the tenant organizing, and also specifically interventions like the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which is actively working to take land off of the private market and move it under community stewardship and community ownership. So actually being able to, I think, to look at all of these kinds of strategies in tandem shows a really awesome kind of strength that Parkdale has. Parkdale's always had the strong culture of resistance, and a place that I constantly am learning from. But once again, I think being able to have these kinds of connections and conversations between communities that are going through these types of active displacement projects is really critical. And so just really grateful to be here and learn more from everyone.
Thanks so much to both of you. Fayez, can you tell us a bit about Brick by Brick?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and Mercedes, it's really very inspiring what you're talking about. I think Parkdale is probably one of the biggest inspirations for at least for me, for what I do here in Park Extension. What I love so much about it is there's the tenant organizing aspect, there's the lobbying bit, there's getting participative planning, and also actually developing real estate projects for local low-income residents. So, you know, I think that so basically at Brick by Brick, we're going backwards, and the reason why we're going backwards is because I had experienced organizing with community organizations for a very long time, and I got a little bit kind of tired of of the funding cuts and of always having to start over Vince, one of the things that I take from what you were saying was that, you know, when you do one project, it's so hard to keep going. And in order to get momentum, you have to bring an entire neighborhood together. And so it's kind of based on that, that my colleagues and I started Brick by Brick some 4 or 5 years ago. And the idea was to basically to support the local tenants' rights organizations and other community organizations in the work that they do, but to really focus our efforts on building affordable housing for low-income tenants in our neighborhood. The local tenants' rights group is underfunded, and the ability to respond is very difficult because they support local tenants in defending their rights, but local tenants often don't want to or cannot be reached because they don't speak French or English, or they may not have status. So, you know, going to the REGI, our tenant landlord tribunal here, is something that is not really accessible. And I think that Ali Khan would probably have seen that over the years, that while there are democratic processes and spaces for low-income people to fight for their rights, it's still very, very difficult to do so. So we really try to focus on developing housing. And I got into this because I thought that it would be, you know, easier, but it really isn't. The why isn't it easy? I'll bring it back to Samuel Stein's book. The reason why I got to reading that book, I'm so sad that I found out about the book before I knew I was going to be on this, because I would have taken more diligent notes. I would have taken notes actually. But the reason why I read it is because I got in touch with Norma, who is part of the Planners Network and was one of the organizers of this thing. And I was like, hey, Norma, I really want to learn more about planning, because I want to figure out what's going to come next in my neighborhood so that I can focus the energies of my organization and grab those properties before the developers do. Or at least bring all the community organizations together to claim those spaces before they get kind of developed and the planning process kind of gets rammed through without proper consultation. And so I was like, yeah, so I wanted to learn about planning some more. And then that's how I got to reading this book. And I think that one of the things the book highlights a lot that I've seen or that I've learned throughout this process is that the way development works in Montreal, and I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, is that like a very, very established business people get financing from banks and investment firms that collect the pools of money that workers put in their retirement funds, and they develop with anticipation that they'll be able to rent or sell those units to people who themselves are able to get the loans from the banks to finance their project. So the way I see it is that the source of the problem that we have here that makes the housing so inaccessible and expensive and makes it really difficult for developers like Brick by Brick to compete against developers, because just as parenthesis, social housing development is just real estate development, but leaving money on the table. That's all it is. And so what makes it really hard for us to offer housing to low-income people, and what makes it so unaffordable for low-income people, is that it's inequality. It's the fact that there are some people in our cities that have more money than they need, and that they're able to save and lend through the intermediaries of institutions like banks to other people who want to secure their own future, to invest in their own nest eggs, and entrepreneurs who want to who see an opportunity to develop in areas that are up and coming. And those areas that are up and coming in Montreal include Park Extension, where we're developing. So so that's kind of like one of the issues that one of the problems that we're facing. And you would think that part of the solution comes from the city, because the city is supposed to be democratic. So, you know, we were able to collect a lot of money in order to develop our first project, but it was very, very difficult to get it going because when we went to the city with a potential project, in order to make it viable, we had to have a certain critical mass of units. We had to have a lot of units to fit in a little piece of land. And the people at the city told us, oh, you can't actually build more than, you know, 3 floors or X amount of units because, you know, we want to green the area. We want to make it more inviting for families. I mean, I think what their idea of family is a little bit different from what I've observed in my neighborhood. But yeah, they want to scale down the projects. And in fact, even if we had friends in City Hall, it would be very hard to get projects to get through because local residents who are getting into the neighborhood and investing wouldn't really want to see large development projects go up that are designed for low-income people. So this is exactly what Sam was saying about being kind of between a rock and a hard place. Like on the one hand, there's a pressure from the market, and on the other hand, there's a planning process at the city, which is in theory supposed to be democratic, but really is kind of like influenced or determined, I guess, by certain kinds of ideas of what a pleasant, habitable city should look like, and local residents aren't really engaged in that process. Like in my neighborhood here, 3/4 of the residents don't speak French or English, so going to City Hall and participating in the process is nonsense. I mean, they're never invited to anything anyway. The people who do show up though are people who move into the neighborhood because they believe that it's going to change. So I think that it's like a really huge huge problem to try to address. I think that obviously, like as my patriots here mentioned, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of organizing tenants. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of lobbying the city, but also trying to get our people in positions of power in the city. I think there's also a lot of work to be done in kind of like raising awareness and innovating to offer solutions to people who are actually, kind of like allies, who see that there's a problem, who have resources to help, who don't know what to do. And I think the reason why I say that is because I see a lot of tenants' rights groups and a lot of nonprofit developers lobbying the city and the province to reinvest in social housing. But in Montreal, and Montreal actually invests a lot in social housing, only 5% of the budget is allocated to housing. And real estate in Montreal, 97% of all real estate investment is private. So even if you were to get the city to double its budget, the impact you would have is really insubstantial. And in the past 12 years, we've had only one social housing project go up in the neighborhood. It was small. It was like 25 units. And you have 1,000 people on the waiting list. Those are people who are naive enough to think that they're going to get a spot. So I think that what I'm trying to do with Brick by Brick is to find ways to bring money from the private sector in order to develop social housing. It's not the only solution, but I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the resources that are available are out there, outside of government, and there's a lot of people who have resources that would gladly support our initiatives, be it tenants' right organizing or affordable housing development. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Fayez. So that's a lot to think about. There's been a focus in this discussion from very different perspectives on the kind of the positionality of the government of the state of in the democratic city, and how it's positioned vis-a-vis real estate capital or vis-a-vis housing as a right. So let's talk about that, and specifically, what are the kinds of policies that we might be fighting for? Maybe I'll ask Sam. This is the last kind of discussion question before we'll open it up to the audience. Sam, can you tell us a little bit about this positionality, how you see urban planning and government and policymakers in this situation? And then after that, can the panelists maybe give a handful of concrete examples, just really short, about specific kind of policies that you see really making a big change here, whether they be like tax policies or rent protection policies or various things like that. Some ideas that you think would really change the housing dial, make things generally sort of reframe the rules for the housing market to make it work for more people. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks. So we have talked a lot about planners, and I think we've gotten a few different perspectives on why they do what they do, but nobody is happy about it, which I think is accurate. And I think it's worth asking, like, why is it so hard for planners to actually produce an affordable city if we assume that that's what they wanted to do? And I think Vince in particular has challenged that assumption, but let's just say that they did, or at least some of them did. So why is that so difficult? And I think that there's a couple different kinds of explanations that we have to grapple with if we want them to behave differently than they do, or if we want to replace them with some other kind of system. The first is that planning in a private land market is itself a contradiction. It's not impossible. It's very possible. We've seen hundreds of years of history of it, but it is contradictory. A private land market is essentially a spoils system in which whoever owns the land generally gets to keep the value of it as it increases. And a lot of that increase in the value has nothing to do with anything that the person who owns the land did. It has to do with all sorts of social factors. That could be public investment, as in the government provision of infrastructure that suddenly connects one piece of land to something else. It's the economic work of investing in and doing the labor in industries that are nearby other pieces of land, and then suddenly that secondary piece of land becomes more valuable. It's also the social work of cultural production. All the work that communities do to make a place what it is then gets usurped by whoever owns the land, who can then sell it to somebody else who can pay a lot more to experience that culture that they didn't create. So that's kind of the spoils system version of land ownership. Meanwhile, the planners and the public come along and do many of the things that might make a place better, right? They might improve the transit system. They might add parks and schools and all the kind of like left-hand good side of the state, welfare state. They do all those things, and then one of the results is that the land becomes more valuable because now it is better connected. Now it is more quote unquote livable. Now it might even be more sustainable and last longer against the rising tides of climate change. And so if the planners keep doing sort of good work and it results in higher land values, then the people that those planners might care the most about don't get to benefit from it, and in fact may be displaced as a result of it. And then communities, working class communities, can find themselves in a really terrible position of rejecting all sorts of public amenities that they had long organized for, because now it will come with the rising kind of wave of investment capital that threatens to displace them. And that's an impossible position that nobody should be in, but that millions of people find themselves in. So that's one set of explanations. The other is capital also organizes against what we might call progressive planning in the planners network framework. This happens through capital mobility. If a city institutes a really strict regime of rent controls and social housing and public housing and all the rest, real estate investment capital might pull out and go someplace else. And disinvestment is not a pretty sight in a capitalist economy either. We can have capital strikes where companies sort of refuse to locate in a particular area because they have strong workers' rights or other kinds of tenant protections. We also have kind of organized discipline on the part of capital through municipal credit rating agencies. 3 organizations, 3 private corporations, Moody's, Fitch's, and Standards & Poor's, will rate every single government in the world, essentially, on a scale of how worthy they are of credit. And if they don't like the way that the government is operating, they can downgrade their credit score and effectively punish them, because, and cities are reliant on those bond markets largely because national governments have disinvested from cities. And so that puts them in this position where they're as much accountable to their voters and the people of their city as they are not only to investors, but to this sort of secondary class of financial disciplinarians. Anyway, this is an extremely bleak picture, but it's the one we live in. And so if we want to change that, we are going to have to confront the nature of private land ownership, and B, the organized aspect of the capitalist class.
Yeah. So to get there, what are some points that we can fight for?
Well, can we jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, one thing that I'm extremely frustrated by is zoning. I mean, a lot of times people in the community sector will rail against politicians. And here in Park Extension, we have a very unique situation where one of our residents that was a comrade got elected as the mayor of the borough. And it was so strange, you know, because she would be in demonstrations just a few years before. And so this seemed like an amazing opportunity to change things. And soon after she got in, the same thing that happens to all politicians waiting to get into office is there's a deadlock, because she was stuck between the people that she was accountable to at the center of the city, the party, and the local residents who didn't really know what the limitations of her power was. And what I learned as a limitation of the power of politicians is that they actually don't really have a lot of power when it comes to planning and zoning. That's actually bureaucrats who take care of it. So that when you make a proposal, let's say we want to do a huge social housing project, it doesn't go to politicians, it goes to bureaucrats, professionals, technicians. And those technicians are people who like follow a bunch of guidelines about like density and building height and like what the use of a building can be. You know, you can't put a community center in the middle of a residential street or whatever. And so it never really, oftentimes like interesting projects don't go past those people. So I think that one interesting thing should be participative planning. You know, I think that there's a big revamp of the democratic process that needs to happen in the city.
That makes sense. More grassroots participation in the process, people defining their neighborhoods, and that echoes a lot of what Mercedes was saying. I think about Parkdale in the kind of reconnecting to the democratic grassroots and shaping the city. Thanks, Fayez. Can we have like some capsule answers as well from the other panelists? What are some policies or some ideas you're fighting for, or some specific ways of taking control of finance for the social good?
I mean, could I say something? So I think Ali Khan had already kind of very eloquently like put out all of the demands, which I think have been the same for a very long time, right? It's like, you know, rent controls for now, like an eviction moratorium, the cancellation of rent debt. And I think, you know, I also was really glad that Ali Khan, you brought in the work of the evictions, the emergency kind of tent support network. Because we have to see all of this as connected as well. Like often you can kind of split up issues of being unhoused and kind of the homelessness crisis from like a tenant's right perspective, they need to be combined, right? It's I think Neil Smith says this as well. Whenever there's a kind of like a ghetto or like a let's say like a Skid Row kind of area, like where I work in downtown East Side, a lot of these kind of pressures and dynamics of the capitalist system are turned into like a myth, right, in that center, and it can be split off from the rest of it. But, you know, it's kind of like, especially with something like this Broadway plan, which, you know, institutes a plan across the whole city, it's kind of like what they say, you know, Foucault's boomerang, right? You test out something in the colony, it comes back to the rest of the city, let's say. And so, you know, we're seeing this kind of plan that was like tossed out in the downtown East Side and Chinatown a couple of years ago, and now it's being brought into the rest of the city, and we have to confront it as such. And in terms of other policy, I don't know, it's like nothing short of the complete decommodification of housing will, like, it's not going to solve anything really. And I think specifically I want to address like the planning and planners here, because originally the question, I really liked the original question. It's kind of funny. It was like, what do you consider your work as an organizer as part of like urban planning? And I was thinking about it, I was like, well, maybe like dialectically, like because you need two to tango, and like if it really were up to me, sorry about this guys, I would want to see the complete abolition of planning, because unless we're like in power, it's not going to make a difference. We're not People's Republic of Mount Pleasant, right? We're not going to be able to do. There's a really interesting thing in Montreal, where there was the Montreal citizens movement that they were fighting in the 70s for essentially planning and zoning to be controlled like by neighborhood, right? But we're really far away from that moment. So until then, you know, if I can direct address planners, it's like, look, folks, we need to understand the technical aspects of this so we can fight them. And unfortunately, it seems like to me, unless, you know, again, I would love to have Mercedes move here, or if I use you, move here. But until that can happen, is that like planners here are completely under the shoe of the real estate market. And as such, you know, if what we really need, if I could use a kind of tired metaphor, is like if the planning machine is like the Death Star, you need to have someone leak the blueprint in order for us to destroy it, right? And as such, it's like we need these essentially the understanding, the tools to map the terrain, right, and build the power to be able to plan once we are in power, right? And I think, yeah, so ultimately, I think it's an organizing question, at least from my perspective.
Okay.
Can I jump in? And I'm sorry, Anna, we're going into like a total esoteric shift from policy discussions, I feel like. So I'll come back to policy afterwards. I just kind of want to like both agree and kind of push back on Vince as one of the planners on this discussion. And I think I completely agree in terms of thinking about the institutional forms of planning and how it's been directly tied into state strategies. So 100% agreed with you. Planning, though, I think as a practice, as this ability to build visions, is actually something that I think is so deeply ingrained in organizing frameworks. And so like one set of questions I always jump back to is by Charlene Crothers, who's a Black feminist organizer in the States, who set out these 5 core questions around organizing principles. And 2 of them specifically are like, what are we building towards? What are, you know, our 40-year strategies? What are our current strategies? How are we trying to build towards these radical visions that we're trying to set out for? And are we ready to win, right? Like, what are the actual structures, infrastructures that we need to actually be able to produce the kinds of changes that we want to see? So I think if planning could better support liberation movements, if it could actually be grounded in a way that's supporting racial and disability justice movements, that's committed to the abolition of prisons and policing, that's committed to the abolition of private property. And once again, I think I saw in the chat, decolonization being, of course, a core principle and actually thinking about those kinds of strategies really do come to mind. And so like in that note, I think immediately to communities like Six Nations and 1492 Land Back Lane and the types of direct struggles that are taking place there against development pressures. And Ali Khan, I know you can speak a little bit to some of those pieces too. So those are the things that immediately come to mind when I think about planning itself and where it can actually serve in support of community visions and community organizing that's taking place. In terms of actually thinking about some of like policy pieces that do come into play, once again, so many of them have been said. even like on a very a basic level, some of the pieces we've been pushing for that really aren't necessarily the most radical are things like inclusionary zoning. The way that they're currently being set out by the province, especially, and then also by the city, are very clearly not allowing for the types of pushes we're actually trying to see against development forces. But more broadly, I think I kind of want to just cite really quickly a couple policy suggestions we were hearing earlier this year in response to COVID-19, and people in the neighborhood were really trying to think about what those questions around, like, what does recovery and rebuild look like, but especially what does transformation look like? And of course, the number one key feedback we kept hearing back through these consultations was around housing justice. So kind of like we were hearing, like rent control, the eviction moratoriums, the ending of clearing encampments, preservation and expansion of deeply affordable, supportive, and social housing is a key thing where you could actually see core investments coming forward. There's really tangible opportunities when thinking about movements to defund the police. And I don't just say this as a budgetary movement, because I think that can take away, especially from Black organized movements and Indigenous organized movements that are really trying to push this to the fore. But there are so many beautiful visions that are coming forward about how, if we can just simply target those policing budgets, and police, of course, being such a core agent in gentrification practices and eviction practices, et cetera, that you can actually reinvest those resources into housing and see a real transformative change happening there. Decommodification, of course, is like a huge piece that we continue to hear coming forward, and actual supports for community land trusts that aren't just trying to compete with private market, that are actually community-based and able to engage through democratic processes, because I think that's also a risk that sometimes takes place with land trusts, is moving into a space where you just become another developer, as with public housing, right? So you can see these kinds of efforts coming in. And then one last thing I'll quickly allude to is once again, this question of, like, these vacant properties, vacant units, and how do we actually take these back? There are potentially federal expropriation powers that could be tapped into, that need to be moved forward. And it's just a simple matter of, like, actually having a collective movement to push for these. Ali Khan, you can probably speak to some of the awesome organizing happening around the We charity and some of their properties in Toronto. But once again, just like all of these are the kinds of things that do come to mind. It is possible, but yeah, that's all for me.
Okay, thanks. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. We have a number of them in the chat, and maybe the first question, I think, Mercedes, you just talked about, is the centrality of the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police movement, both not just as a budgetary thing. I think you've talked to that. I think there's a question about land owners. There's a lot of talk and chat and questions about land ownership, land trusts, about decolonization and the role that might have in sort of looking for different ways of planning and land, so that it's more of less of an extractive process and maybe more reciprocal with the land and with each other. There's a lot of strategies that go with that. Do panelists want to think big with us on those kind of things? Any work going on or connections with ideas of, I know Parkdale has the land trust going on, with decolonization, with ownership, with sort of removing the kind of unearned increment or the rent from property. Sorry, I've been asked to ask the question as it is. So Mia, what is the relationship between land trusts as a strategy to raise community control and stewardship of the land and tenant organizing in these scenarios? That's more specific. Thank you, Mia. Does anyone want to
I can give a very quick answer to
Right.
start us off, which is just to say that I think there is a technocratic version of the community land trust model, which imagines that these things will sort of emerge because they're good and the state will grant them property because they should. And I don't think that has ever happened and ever will. It's always because of organizing, and that organizing is largely tenant organizing. It's also other, what the planners might call community stakeholders, but basically it's everybody in the area pushing and forcing the state to do this and limiting the kind of mobility and privilege of capital to that land first. So there is no successful community land trust model or any other kind of decommodified land and housing model without a tremendous amount of organizing first.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a lot of organizing to be done for community land trust, because traditionally, if you want to, normally if you want to develop affordable housing, you can't hold it in a community land trust because community land trusts cannot technically be sold, and so the guarantee from the bankers, from the underwriters, is void. So that's why we don't see we don't see any community land trusts in Montreal right now. All nonprofit developers hold it as nonprofits or cooperatives. The only land trust that exists is at the Milton Park, and in that case, it was the result of huge amounts of organizing, along with the involvement of a very, very wealthy philanthropist, heir to the Seagram's fortune, and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which would never, ever get involved in anything like that ever again. So yeah, a lot of stakeholders for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Fayez, that sort of brings in, your efforts around looking at sort of social and alternative financing that can fill in the gap for some of these, or offer an alternative model to the regular kind of financialization of housing. Let's talk to Jessica's question about the role of the federal government. I mean, a lot of this stuff is not really in municipal control, a lot of the stuff we're talking about. So are there specific things that the federal government could do to, to adjust the market as a whole, and also to offer some of the demands and protections that people are fighting for? Capital gains tax on housing wealth, some kind of a progressive taxation, other kind of ideas.
Maybe I could jump in real quick. I think the federal government can use its expropriation powers. It definitely can. I mean, there's a few things I want to talk about, but in terms of the federal government, or to comment on some of the other panelists that have said, but the federal government, what they need to be doing right now is using their expropriation powers. They could expropriate a sufficient amount of property to end homelessness overnight right now, if they wanted to, in a matter of days. That's the elephant in the room. You can end homelessness overnight. The only issue is, and as Sam so eloquently put it in his book, the only issue is the idea that private property is held up as sacrosanct in this society, and we cannot do anything to even put a slight chill on investment or the idea that private property will be protected at all costs, because that's the purpose of our state, is to protect private property. Some of these demands aren't necessarily federal; they are more provincial, because I think housing generally is like more of a provincial jurisdiction. But maybe I could just list a couple, because I didn't go over all of them in quite detail. But I just want to put out there that like a lot of these demands that are doable right now are reformist policies. And what is needed here, and just to go back to what Samuel was saying about, we live in it's like a spoils-based system. I could not agree with that more. Planning can have its role in this system. However, it's not going to reach its full potential, as Mercedes was outlining. That the full potential of planning cannot be realized until the abolishment of private property is achieved, in my opinion. And in order to do that, we need to develop revolutionary politics amongst the working class. So we can call for all these reformist policies, such as, for instance, like instead of opening up these rent banks and forcing tenants to go into more debt to pay rent that they couldn't pay through no fault of their own or whatever, we could be canceling rent. We could be calling for vacancy control, an end to the decontrol, so that you have rent control on vacant units. We could be calling for what do I have here? RGI housing, so people don't spend more than 20% of their income on rent. But at the end of the day, it comes down to expropriation, and I think that like so. I just real quickly, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long here, but a couple of things that really popped out to me in your book, Samuel, is the two contradictions that you outlined, the contradictions of property and the contradiction of capitalism versus democracy. And those two contradictions, real quick, the contradiction of property, meaning that, you know, property owners or landowners, they want state intervention to some extent, but they want the state to back off. They don't want state overreach. They don't want quote unquote communism, but they're very much reliant on state intervention, even though they may not want to admit it. So that's that contradiction. And then the other contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Capitalism requires full say and the last word on everything, but they cannot get away with a lot of things they do without giving the appearance of consultation. And as we see in even like resource extraction and stuff like that, with indigenous groups fighting back against pipelines and fracking and all that stuff all across the country, whatnot. It's these consultative processes are very much just like disingenuous, like participatory, like rubber stamp process. Yes, we did this. Yes, we consulted, and that kind of thing. So, and I'd just like to also point out that the point that you made earlier, Samuel, about like this issue of like rich people feeling totally free to ask for greening and nice neighborhoods and all this stuff or whatever, while poor neighborhoods can't even ask for that stuff because they know that asking for that stuff, if they were to get it, that means that implies their displacement. That can also be superimposed on a global scale with imperialism and stuff like that, where you have like these countries that are just gutting social services and gutting labor rights and environmental protections and stuff like that, just so they can draw these investments in, and you can't. And anyway, I don't want to go on more longer than that, but like, yeah. So some of those policies are very reformist to cap it off, but at the end of the day, we need a paradigm shift. We need people to understand that private property needs to be abolished, and we need to mobilize, and we need to take our cues from Indigenous peoples, because no conversation about expropriation can exclude the very fact that we're on stolen land, and that needs to be very much a respected conversation that is led by Indigenous voices.
Okay, that links to, I think, the next couple questions I'm going to pull up from here. First, just to mention that Stephen makes a couple points here in the questions. I'm not sure they're actually questions, but one is about pointing out that, you know, it's not just about these intensely focused superstar cities, that there's a lot of other places that we can look at. And then the set of questions let's move to next is both from Mazdak. These are great questions. Thanks everyone. And Mariah. I'm going to put them together because I think they might have some commonality. If Mazdak asks, if land values are a major driving factor of the problem, what is your vision for decolonizing the land to help our communities? And then, sorry, I meant not Mariah, Mia. Reflecting on Sam's comment around owners reaping the spoils of public and social investments in the city, how do we insert this into the narrative to agitate, organize, and lift up the need to democratize these investments? I don't know if it's okay to put those questions together, but to me, they both have this common element of the kind of land value issue.
Those are three big and good questions. And I think the second two go together really well. So I'm just going to address the first one real quick, which was like, what about the other places that aren't New York City, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, which is a perfectly valid question. I think the author of the question goes on to say that, you know, that basically that there's a lot of other places that are doing really, you know, struggling in what I would consider a state of disinvestment. And I'd make the case that this is the way capitalism functions geographically, which is to say unevenly in the sort of classic terms. Money goes into one place and comes out of another for a while and then moves again. Capitalism doesn't do well with stability. It also doesn't do well with equilibrium. So in the second half of Stephen's question, he says, you know, maybe like the, you know, people with money should move to those places which are currently disinvested. That has happened. That is gentrification. That's how we get to where we are right now. And then it sort of keeps rolling in a different direction. So I would say that this is exactly how the system reproduces itself. And we have to get out of that binary where basically the choices places face is disinvestment or gentrification. Neither of works well for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, it just very recently in with the COVID, because I'm also a real estate agent, and what I've noticed, everyone has noticed, is that actually the inoccupancy rate has finally, after so many years, come up a bit in the city. That we're looking at price drops in the city, especially for apartments like condos. And the suburbs and the countryside has just exploded. And now the countryside, there's a lot of speculation of land in the country, and basically a lot of, it was already happening because zoning is municipal. A lot of municipalities in the country are basically becoming suburbanized, and this whole thing that planners have been railing against for decades around urban sprawl is just in full swing all over again. So in this case, the people who are being expropriated are kind of like country folks who are taking up really lousy small units that don't meet their lifestyle and the natural habitats. So when you have de-gentrification in one area, you have gentrification in another area.
Thanks, Sam and Faiz. Those comments are linked. We have 3 minutes left, or a couple minutes left. I want to respect people's time, although we can leave it open after that to keep chatting if people are interested. Is there anything else people want to say? I think we've had like a pretty interesting mix of perspectives that have really converged on kind of helping us to understand some of the reasons for the situation that we're facing in housing, and really appreciate the struggles that are going on in these cities on the ground and all the work that you're doing there. And so and some really interesting kind of like framings of the kind of systemic or specific changes that can help us get to a fairer housing situation that's not exploitative. So yeah, thanks everyone. Anyone want to have a last mic drop? I really appreciate all the people who've joined us here for this conversation.
I mean, it's only 4 p.m. for me, so I like, or whatever. It's not want to keep going, like, but I know it's late for you guys. Like, I would want to keep going.
I'm cool with continuing too. I feel like we're just getting started in a way.
We're just getting started, man. Like,
okay. Norma, what do you think? Should we just like let's just let it roll? We can always just put the first hour and a half up later, and the people who have to leave can leave. Okay, the admin says 15 minutes more. Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So we keep on with the questions, or do you want to like pick up on some threads that that have emerged here?
I'd like to ask. And this is like organizer talk, right? So I just want to ask like tactical questions, especially because, you know, I know it was very nice what you guys said about Vancouver, but obviously we look to you guys all the time in Parkdale's. Like, so we're having a lot of questions around like COVID and how to organize during COVID, right? Just like the traditional door knock is not so easy anymore, right, with COVID restrictions. And I'm also thinking about like, okay, so not to dunk on planners too much, but like a lot of people, what they do here, especially where they're learning a little bit, but like they're still fundamentally like brain broken. So they'll do a consultation, right? And the consultation is a fine place to get a sandwich and a free pen, but otherwise like nothing else happens. Like they will take your opinion, put it in the box, and they like toss it away, and the capitalists just do whatever they want, right? And so for us, like us thinking through the plan, or like, you know, like a citywide plan, the planning process as a terrain, we're thinking, okay, so they're not even gonna give you the sandwich anymore, right? Because it's all online now. It's not over COVID, like they're not even doing the open house. So I think that like, you know, presents some opportunities, at least for us to be like, well, let's just skip the process. Like, let's just cut straight through it. Because if they're gonna like, you know, their sham democracy that comes through participatory planning, if they're even closing that off even more, like is that not an opportunity for us to take more revolutionary stances and tactics, right? But my question is for, you know, Ali Khan and Mercedes, like how have you guys been doing this organizing during COVID? I think that's a really necessary question.
Ali Khan, do you want to start us off, or maybe?
Sure. You can go ahead if you like.
Maybe one thing I'll just throw in is like,
okay.
You go.
Yeah, I mean it.
Sorry, tech issues just happened. Ali Khan, you go for it.
No worries. Can you hear me? I feel like I'm choppy on my end. Okay. Yeah. Just going for it. I mean, like, oh my God. Sorry, I kind of jumbled a bunch of my thoughts in the last thing that I was saying, but yeah, I would like with the imperialism bit, I was referring to like cities desperate to like draw investment and stuff like that, as opposed to that other phenomenon of like poor neighborhoods being hesitant to ask for improvements, which is a separate issue. But I'm sorry, I kind of dumped those two ideas together. But to respond to you, Vince, I think like I think a lot of the battle right now, from my perspective, is just to kind of show people how hopeless this process is. You know what I mean? Or help to show people how hopeless this process is, and how along class lines the decisions are made, and how, you know, like the idea of as you put it in your book, I believe you said that, or it's a common expression, Samuel, that the governments of capitalist societies are essentially the executive committees of the bourgeoisie type of thing. Yeah. So it's like to just demonstrate how that works in practice. So for instance, you see, you know, like wage subsidies going, instead of going towards workers, they go towards shareholders as dividends and stuff like that. You see rent moratoriums for small businesses, and rent forgiveness for small businesses and stuff like that. But you never see like wage increases or pay sick leave or anything like that. You know, we've got the NDP that's in Ontario talking about, oh yeah, we know we need to pay sick leave, and John Tory, our mayors, we need paid sick leave and stuff like that. But the NDP over in BC has the ability to do that right now, and they're not going to give paid sick leave for some reason. But in every other province where they're not in power, they're talking about paid sick leave or whatever, and they're just tossing the football back and forth, right? And then like that other contradiction of like these processes or whatever, like so. And sorry, just quick, as an example of like that first contradiction of property, like in Toronto, they opened up all these like they gave easements to all these restaurants to like take over the sidewalks, and they called it Cafe TO and stuff to save small businesses and stuff like that, right? And so they're like onto the bike lanes. They've got like these outdoor dining rooms and whatnot. And the planners are, I don't know if this is the planners jurisdiction or whatever, but they jumped through hoops to give all these special zoning exceptions to restaurants and stuff like that to save the small business owner, like the petit bourgeoisie or whatever. But then, you see like a few tents in a park, and all of a sudden, the city's saying, oh, these are their bylaw infractions and this kind of thing, right? So like that selective intervention, right? They're like they're kind of speaking to that or whatever. But yeah, I mean, in terms of blocking evictions and stuff like that, we're trying to really just, organize, like you said, Vince, like larger neighborhoods, because when you organize at the building, as you said, like you tend to get caught in this cycle of like putting out small fires and stuff like this without building a class consciousness and like a class-based perspective. So I think the larger fight of making people realize that, these fights are along class lines. These are very deliberate decisions. These aren't accidents, like when the city says we tried our best, or when the province said, it's the federal government, and the city says it's the provincial government, and everybody just kind of passes blame and back and forth. This is a very deliberate way to avoid accountability and stuff like that. Anyway, I'll pass to Mercedes. I'm going on forever here.
I love it. Maybe just one thing I'll add in terms of just like what this has looked like in the midst of the pandemic, because of course, like you see for a long time, at least what we were seeing was that planning itself to a certain extent was shut down. Like the processes were shut down, and all of a sudden, at a certain point, they just opened the floodgates, and there was this onset of development meetings and applications that were suddenly coming through because they had been held up for so long. And as a part of this, we had just like all of these online consultation processes that were incredibly inaccessible. If you did not have any access to tech or phone, then there was no way of accessing these. We, at least at the drop-in where I work, we opened up a space where people could come in and participate through like keeping socially distanced and indoors. But even that, of course, isn't necessarily the safest means. So just once again, it just goes to show that they were really eager and urgent to put forward these development processes in check without actually paying attention to people's social needs at the moment. So what we were doing during COVID-19 was specifically supporting with a mutual aid network that was growing throughout the neighborhood, providing social and material supports to one another within buildings, across blocks, and across the neighborhood and different communities. So I think this was a really strong space of relationship building, of creating solidarity amongst community members. Simple things like people just sharing their groceries or creating, like handing out candy or cookies to each other led easily into opportunities for tenant organizing as well that were supported by wider tenant organizing efforts. So it just went to show that people actually were able to display that they had each other's backs, that they were looking out for each other, and were able to then intervene in these longer term, more systemic visions of what's possible. So we're really trying to move from what is the direct supports that are needed for people during COVID-19, and how do we actually build this into more sustainable movements? So that's what I would answer for that too.
Thank you. Oh yeah, I also wanted to say one tactical thing. Very impressed by your eviction blockade action. It was different for us though, because essentially, so we did pull off a eviction blockade, but right at the site of the eviction. And that's because unlike Ontario or Toronto, it's not like they're all dispatched from the same place, right? So because you guys blocked it at the site of where they dispatch the little piggy cars to go evict people. For us, because BC is a wonderful place. There's 6 different bailiffs, and they all operate on different sides of the city, and you actually don't know which one they're gonna send, right? So we just had to camp out at the site for 3 days. But yeah, no, I'm gonna say you guys did a fantastic job on that one.
On that point, real quick, if you don't mind, I think you're referring to the day when we blocked the sheriffs at the actual dispatch site, right? Or at the courthouse where they dispatch from. That was more of yes, we did block the evictions for that day. That would have happened. But I mean, that was more of a symbolic thing to galvanize and create that solidarity amongst ourselves and stuff like that. So, I mean, but in terms of blocking at the actual site of the eviction, blocking at the door, it's proven to be quite difficult for a lot of reasons, I think. If I could just quickly go over tactically, what I mean by that, so blocking evictions, everyone, and I know many of you may already know this or definitely already know this, but like always people think, you know, then eviction is like a sheriff coming and then, you know, you block the sheriff and then the sheriff leaves and then you successfully block the eviction. And what we've seen is that, you know, first of all, the vast majority of displacement from poor neighborhoods is not from the eviction process. People can't pay rent and then they leave voluntarily. That's the vast majority of people. So like the eviction numbers we see are a small fraction of the displacement that's happening in places like Parkdale and elsewhere, other low income newcomer immigrant communities, working class communities. But like, yeah, so the actual eviction, when the sheriff comes, which is, again, a very small fraction of the people that are displaced, the sheriff comes, what we've seen is we block the sheriff and then the sheriff calls the police and then the police come and then by then we've gathered a bunch of us in a critical mass of people to physically block the eviction or whatever. And then the police just leave, right? And then they'll come back in unmarked vehicles in the middle of the night and they'll carry out the eviction like a week later or 2 weeks later. And so they can just wait us out. So like tactically speaking, it's so difficult because you can't just do it once. You need this like sustained scouting system where like people are on call. There's a rapid response list. There's a whole community of people and, you know, a list that is far more than the critical mass needed to block the cops and stuff like that. And it needs to be ongoing and continuous. And then the fact that, you know, like these eviction moratoriums are happening and stuff like that, people are leaving voluntarily. Also the fact you need to convince someone to give you consent to block the eviction. So like someone needs to give you, first of all, agree to refuse to leave their home when the sheriff comes and trust that you're going to be there to have their back on an ongoing continuous basis. And meanwhile, these landlords have so much money that they could just wait for like a whole year to evict you. Like it's no skin off their back to wait a few weeks until your organizing has been like, you know, tapped out or whatever. So that's like tactically on the ground where we're really, really trying to figure out like ways to do this in a systematic way, or kind of making it up as we go along while trying to see what other people are, what other folks are doing across Turtle Island and elsewhere.
I got a note about the first question from Jaggy, a question about, is the demand to defund the police resonating with your groups and organizations in terms of freeing up funds for actual useful things like social housing, social supports? And I think Mercedes talked about this, but maybe the other two cities could chime in.
Well, like, yeah, just like down the street, there's a big incident. It's horrifying. It's so stupid that there's like a cafe owner who like got 3 minutes of straight airtime to complain about how there's like a homeless person on their stoop, right? And it was ridiculous because, you know, just people's like hysteria that they go through when they see someone peeing, or like it speaks to the perversion of a certain class, I would say. But it is like, I think, fundamental to our fight, right? And the work I do in the downtown east side is like, we're always talking about, you know, what we call the social determinants of health, right? It's a drug users union, but eventually, like, you know, the cops being around all the time and their role historically of just pushing people around and getting them out of sight is definitely like, yeah, that's like the strong arm of gentrification, right? And I would hope that like the larger tenants movement outside of the downtown east side can see this. Essentially, yeah, the police is, not only are they stealing money out of our pockets through taxes, but they're shaking people down in the downtown east side, not just for money or drugs, but also to take their tent and take their, you know, all of their belongings, like just every day, right? It's horrific. And yeah, so I think there's an interest for all of us, not just on a strictly kind of moral human level that this is repulsive, but also on like, yeah, like a level that they're siphoning funds to do the work of gentrification. And I think what Ali Khan brought up with the patios, like that was, yeah, that also, you know, pinged for me here. Like, we had the same process where, you know, suddenly the patios were bursting open all across the gentrified neighborhoods in the city. And yeah, it's like, plain and simple, it's like patio imperialism, right? They need, this is like a way for them to justify more police presence in our neighborhoods. Again, draining money because it costs a lot of, I remember, okay, so like we had this place called Oppenheimer Park, where it's historically the site of many tent city struggles, right? And I remember the cost they told us how much it costs to do a sweep. And I think it was like $30,000 every time they do it, right? Because they have to bring out the cops, and then they have to bring out the fire cops, and then they have to bring out the city engineer cops with the pitchforks. $30,000 every time just to sweep the encampment, and then everyone just comes back later in the night, right? And it's this huge drain on funds and energy, and it reproduces this kind of like, terror of the downtown east side. The cops need to go. That's plain and simple.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
About I think the interesting thing about the question is that I think that it's not so much like whether the cops are good or bad, or like whether they need to go. Like obviously they need to go, but it's more like, what are local low-income residents like? How do they feel about that? And from what I can tell about what I see in the neighborhood, it's not really something we can even start bringing up. I mean, it's a conversation that needs to be happening, obviously, but we're not there yet at all. Like when I hear about what's happening in Toronto, I'm just like, wow, that is really amazing. Like right now, where we're at is just getting people together to recognize each other, to feel like they are not alone, to break the isolation, and to have regular gatherings. And the community organizer that is on the ground for Brick by Brick, what she does is really focuses on trying to like get people together around the kind of things that they want to do, and to talk about the issues that are important to them. So like right now, what they want to do is to dance, cook, learn French, and learn about like how to win the immigration refugee process, and the just really basic things like that, like where do I sign up for affordable housing and stuff. We're not at the stage, at the point of having conversations about like defund the police at all. That's like a difficulty I find that in organizing in Park Extension. Not sure what to do about that.
And is there time just to jump in with a really super quick note?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just say one way we've been trying to go about this in Parkdale is that we have a couple different community groups who are really just trying to focus on the basic skills of how community keep each other safe in moments of crisis, and what are real alternatives to calling the police. So we're about to run a bunch of workshops around crisis intervention, around suicide prevention, mental health, harm reduction, conflict resolution, et cetera, and kind of backing it on notions around transformative justice. And so we're hoping that like through these kinds of skill building workshops, it then leads to a space where people feel more open to talk about the calls around defunding the police and what it actually means to create community safety, and what that actually looks like in practice, and building those visions for what that it actually is. So that's one way we've been trying about that, and we're starting that next week. So we'll let you know how it goes. Great,
thanks. Do we have a time? I guess we're kind of out of time, but let's keep going if you want. A couple questions here. Mariah asks, is there a way for activists to participate in planning consultations effectively, or are we just helping to manufacture consent for the developer plans that they're just going to lightly modify in the end? And then linked to that, I think Carl Webb has a beautiful sort of statement question set here. Why are city planners not advocating for more public housing and letting the existing public housing projects decay and be destroyed? I grew up in the housing projects in New Orleans, which have been torn down. Is there now a policy or law against the government owning housing? We have a public education, so why not have public housing? Outside of academia and government employment, where can planners work and not be evil? So that's a kind of a set of questions I see about, sort of how to be involved in planning in an ethical way, in an effective way. And I'm sure that there's a variety of perspectives here, so go for it, Vince.
Yeah, before someone gives a real answer, I would just like to point out that in Vancouver at very least, is that so Vision Vancouver, they were very savvy when they came in with all the redevelopment plans. One of their major redevelopments, and this will, I think people in Toronto should pay attention to this if they're concerned about, let's say, the Honest Ed's development, because it's the same plan, same developers, right? Same like evil geniuses behind it. And so, but when they did that, they partnered with Simon Fraser University to build their downtown campus there. And what did they put at the top of it? The Urban Studies Department, right? And so there's a way in which, like, again, love Mercedes, love you very much. But like, these planners are essentially, they're taught the same thing, right? They reproduce themselves as a class, and they reproduce the same kind of logic, in these schools that are tied to developer interests and city hall and so on, right? So that's not a real answer to the question. I just want to point that out there. But like, I do want to hear this from Mercedes and Sam, for instance.
Yeah, I can jump in really quickly. Just to say, I completely agree. I think also like planning professions in general are also part of this wider push around neoliberalization of university educations. It's considered a professional degree. By virtue of that, you then have to pay way higher tuition costs, which is extremely exclusionary of who can even begin to call themselves a planner in the first place. And Sam, I noticed like in the book you put out, you identify this, right? Like 80% of planners, at least in the States, if I'm correct on this one, are white, plenty are male, so like, it just goes to show who actually does go into this profession and see themselves as the quote unquote, the do-gooders of this work. And I don't by any means like discredit myself and my own positionality within this either. And I think there were some questions coming forward about, what does work in this kind of a realm look like? So I am a paid staff with the Parkdale People's Economy doing planning work, doing this kind of community planning work. There are also organizers and supporters in this work. And then there's a large amount of the work that's also volunteer based. So there are very real discrepancies that come out from like thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex and like what kind of role, myself at least play in that and recognizing the work that comes out of this kind of work too. These are all things that we need to continue to struggle with and to challenge, and I recognize too, but I think that that's a very real component of some of the work. And yeah, those are just some of the thoughts that immediately come to mind.
I'll put in my 2 cents, though I don't have a comprehensive answer, but part of that is because there is no comprehensive answer, and it's we have to be contextually specific. So, in the first question, should you engage with participatory planning processes, or is it just going to be a checkbox and the developer is going to do what they want anyway? Maybe it is. You know your city better than I do. I think there are participatory planning projects that are built to have teeth and authority for the communities that participate in them, and then there are ones that are just a joke. And there's a lot in between. Most of them are in between. There are ones that function as, there's a planning scholar who calls them shadow referendas, to basically figure out where the opposition is. So then the planners and the developers can figure out where they're going to be able to get away with what they want to get away with. So you have to have an analysis of your local state, of your bigger state, and of the broader system, and then make a determination. In terms of where to work, that's an easy one. No, there's no place to work that's ethical. We got to do something about the bigger system in that case. But that's the case whether you're a planner or not. Like Mercedes, I also work in a nonprofit capacity where I try to do good, but like a lot of the best work that I can do is going to be outside of work. And what planners who want to operate that way can do is be a resource within social movement organizations, not replace them, not lead them, but do what we can and plan from the outside. Or if you're on the inside, leak like hell. And maybe I'll end my remarks there.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll end it there. It's getting late. We've been talking for a couple hours, and I want to thank you all for participating, and I really want to thank the audience for coming and listening and talking and chatting and adding your questions too. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them. Let's continue our work and our conversations. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing. And if you're in any of these cities, join the organizations and join the Planners Network too.
Yeah, breakfabriek.com.
Big thanks for all the comments in the chat too, and everyone who joined. There's awesome contributions there. I'm gonna be thinking about this a lot. And I don't know if there's a way to capture the questions, but that'd be cool. And thanks everyone. I love being with friends on this and meeting new folks through this too. So really grateful for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice meeting you folks.
Yeah, nice meeting you.
But